The weight of the gigantic architectural members of the pre-Parthenon over a long distance.
17 kilometers separated the quarry from the Acropolis. To transport the marble blocks over such a distance, the Greeks used wooden carts pulled by mules. It could take an entire day to move a single block from the quarry to the foot of the Acropolis. When they reached the foot of the hill, the Greeks faced one last challenge: how to hoist these blocks weighing several tons to the top of the Acropolis, 157 meters up. Today, the path is particularly steep. But some of the stones found at the site allowed archaeologists to describe what it looked like back in antiquity.
The first ramp that was used to lift the blocks for the pre-Parthenon was this one.
The Greeks built a ramp 10 meters wide and 80 meters long, with an elevation gain of only 10%, ideal for moving the blocks to the top. They put these blocks on a cart, which was hoisted to the top by means of a pulley system firmly anchored to the ground. The rope that lifted this cart was connected by a second cart, pulled to the foot of the ramp by about 15 mules. Once at the foot of the hill, a new block was put in place, and the mules were guided back up to be strapped to the empty cart at the top. This ingenious cable car system allowed each block of marble to be hoisted in just a few hours. While some workers moved the blocks, others began construction of the pre-Parthenon at the top of the Acropolis. To erect the columns of the pre-Parthenon, the Greek builders had to assemble the blocks on top of each other. On the current site, one of the tambours features curious protrusions that don't appear on any other stone. These types of valuable clues gave archaeologists a better understanding of the techniques used by the ancient Greeks.
In classical Greek architecture, lifting the stone was a crucial step to seeing a project through. There were various techniques that allow straps to be attached to the blocks, some with protrusions and others with notches.
The Greeks possessed very sophisticated hoisting devices. Wooden cranes capable of lifting 10-ton loads at a height of nearly 8 meters, the equivalent of a 3-story building. The protrusions were then used as a fastener to lift the blocks with ropes, in order to arrange them on top of each other with precision. Once the columns were carved, the protrusions were removed. But the construction of the pre-Parthenon was never completed. After 7 years, the site came to a sudden halt, even though work on the columns had barely started. The Persians, eager for revenge after their previous defeat, set out to invade Athens. Despite their best efforts, the Greeks lost the battle, and the Acropolis was burned by the Persians.
Everything is destroyed. The pre-Parthenon's destroyed, all the sculptures, buildings that were on the Acropolis are just burnt out shells. It's just the symbolic end of Athens, really.
After the Persians pillaged the city, the Athenian population was traumatized. No reconstruction was undertaken on the hill for years. After 2 decades of fierce struggles and numerous victories against the Persians, Athens began its rebirth around 460 BC. Thanks to the will of powerful leaders, the iconic hill experienced unprecedented architectural upheavals. The Greek builders began the construction of a huge platform at the top of the Acropolis, next to the one that had been erected to build the pre-Parthenon. The original platform was 300 meters long and 85 meters wide. This area was expanded to a width of 150 meters. This gigantic artificial terrace formed an area of 45,000 square meters, the equivalent of more than 4 soccer fields. But these titanic works were only the beginning of what was to come.
The 5th century is often known as a golden age in Athens because lots of major events happen that really shape the Athenians' identity about themselves. So we've got the emergence of democracy as a new experimental political system. Athens becomes the leader of the Greek city-states. So Athens as a city feels pretty emboldened to make more risks and to experiment, and this is reflected in the art that's created during this period.
The man who embodied this architectural renewal was Pericles. Considered the founder of Athenian democracy, this savvy strategist undertook monumental work on the Acropolis in order to make it the cultural and political center of ancient Greece.
In the mind of Pericles, the construction of temples on the Acropolis was closely linked to the promotion of the glory of the Athenian state.
Work on the Parthenon began at the site of the pre-Parthenon. This way, it would be visible from the entire city.
It was the masterpiece of antiquity. The Parthenon stood out among the monuments of the Acropolis and among all the buildings of Athens, thanks to its position at the top of the hill, its dimensions, and its architectural perfection.
By studying the building, scientists were able to establish that the Parthenon was in fact an enlarged copy of the pre-Parthenon. 2 columns were added to its facade and 1 to its length, bringing the building to a width of 31 meters and a length of 70 meters, with a height of 14 meters. A total of 120 columns supported this monumental building. The architects of the Parthenon took the general shape of its predecessor, but they didn't merely draw inspiration from it. The builders also recovered some of its marble that had been salvaged from the fire set by the Persians a few decades earlier.
The marble from Mount Pentelicus was precious, which is why the blocks that survived the destruction of the pre-Parthenon were repurposed to make the Parthenon, after being reworked. The rest of the damaged blocks were used in other structures.
While some blocks of the pre-Parthenon were recycled, the majority of the stones in the building had to be transported from the quarry all the way to the top of the hill. In all, the Greek builders used nearly 20,000 tons of marble to erect the Parthenon. That's the equivalent of twice the weight of the Eiffel Tower. A colossal edifice that sprung from the ground in record time.
Construction went on for 9 years until the year 438. The sculptures were shaped for another 6 years. The overall construction hence took a total of 15 years. This was an exceptionally short amount of time for work of such quality.
It does mean that the completion of the Parthenon in record time was a priority of the Athenian state. It also means that there were hundreds of people employed on the works, and these were a combination of free citizens, foreign residents, and slaves.
The Parthenon was completed only 15 years after work had begun. More than 13,500 blocks of marble were needed to erect this 70-meter long and 31-meter wide building. Its function was to protect the treasure and wealth of Athens, accumulated after the victories of the Greeks over the Persians. Part of this treasure was embodied by a gigantic 12-meter tall statue of Athena, covered with gold. In her right hand, the goddess held a 2-meter statue of Nike, the goddess of victory. In her left hand were a shield and a spear. The room in the center of the Parthenon was designed exclusively to house this monumental sculpture. The Parthenon was meant as a luxurious encasing for this treasure, which no longer exists. Its exceptional dimensions make it the largest marble monument in the world. But beyond its gigantic size, the Parthenon also conceals very subtle secrets of how it was built. These steps, horizontal to the naked eye, are actually curved. Their center is 7 centimeters higher. This choice wasn't made at random. Even though they're curved, the lines appear straight to the observer.
The Parthenon is unique in the degree of detail it contains, and above all, in its optical refinements. The ancient Greeks incorporated imperfections into the plans and construction to make the Parthenon look even more than perfect.
The steps are not the only things that deceive the eye. The columns also appear perfectly straight and at right angles. Yet appearances are deceiving. Each of the columns that make up the Parthenon is actually very slightly tilted towards the interior of the building. So much so that if we extended their lines, they would join about 5 kilometers in space and form a pyramid. But that's not all. In addition to being tilted, the columns bulge a few millimeters about halfway up. Again, this is an optical correction by a process called entasis, which means tension in Greek. When a column is perfectly straight, it looks narrower in the center. The bulge corrects this optical illusion, and the column then appears straight to the naked eye. There are almost no straight lines in the entire structure of the Parthenon. Proof that the ancient Greeks already possessed a perfect mastery of the laws of optics. In just 4 decades, the ancient Greeks created 4 emblematic monuments on the sacred hill. The Parthenon, completed in 432 BC. The Temple of Athena Nike, inaugurated in 421 BC. And the Erection in 406 BC. The 4th construction, the majestic entrance to the site in the form of the Propylaea, was interrupted by the Peloponnesian War in 432 BC. Over the following centuries, the Acropolis was used as a fortress, and the buildings remained relatively intact. During the rule of the Ottoman Empire, the Temple of Athena Nike was dismantled.